Hi again. Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, King Carl X Gustav of Sweden attacked Denmark again, this time to wipe the country off the map. But his plan backfired spectacularly, and Sweden was forced to hand back territory Carl Gustav had won after his daring march across the ice. In what was left of Denmark, King Frederick III exploited the grave situation after the loss of Scania and all the other Danish lands east of the Øresund Strait by crushing the power of the Danish nobility. He managed to make Denmark a hereditary monarchy and himself and his successors for 1,000 generations absolute kings with unlimited power. Even though the new elevated position probably was nice, the loss of Scania still stung. Today, we'll see what the Danes and their new king Christian V were willing to do about it. Episode 98, The Scania War. Looking at a map today, you might think that the current border between Denmark and Sweden makes sense. It seems logical, perhaps even natural, that the water of the Øresund Strait should be what divides the two countries. But that's only because you're most likely used to traveling by car. In the 17th century, and all throughout human existence up until motorization, land, and especially thick forests like the ones in Småland, separated, whereas water united. It was so much more convenient and quick to travel across water than to schlep through woods. So to the 17th century Danes, there was absolutely nothing natural about the new border. It didn't help that the Danish provinces east of the Øresund Strait, that is, Halland, Scania and Blekinge, had been part of Denmark as long as there had been a Denmark. Harald Bluetooth himself, who united the kingdom way back in episode 23, had ruled Scania just as much as Jutland, Funen and Zealand. It was an enormous shock to the system when these bits of the country were ripped away, taken by the Swedes. Not only because this was an integrated part of Denmark, but also because these eastern provinces provided plenty of tax revenue thanks to their excellent farmland and fishing communities. Not to mention the loss of Malmö, the second largest city in Denmark, and Lund, the religious center with its prestigious cathedral where archbishops of yore had conducted coronations of Danish kings. In other words, the loss of Scania and these other provinces was a bitter pill to swallow. Still, Frederick III and his subjects had no choice. At least not at the moment. Swedish rule in Scania started on March 1st, 1658, when a unit of some 2,000 soldiers left the war zone in Zealand and sailed across the Øresund Strait to Scania, where they took over the various fortresses in the western part of the province. The Danish soldiers who had held these positions up until now were shipped back in the other direction to Zealand, unless they were Scanian peasants, in which case they were simply disarmed and sent home to their farms. They would be Swedes from now on. 5 days later, King Carl Gustav himself sailed across the Øresund from Helsingør to Helsingborg, on board King Frederick III's private ship. When the King of Sweden reached Helsingborg, he was met by the Archbishop of Lund, Peter Winstrup, and representatives of the Scanian clergy. The king continued south and entered Malmö on March 9th. There, he received oaths of fealty by the nobility, clerics, burghers and peasants of the newly conquered provinces Halland, Scania and Blekinge. In the middle of March, a small Swedish force entered Blekinge from the north and took control over Christianople, the town Christian IV had founded to try and compete with Kalmar. At the same time, another Swedish contingent took over Bohus Castle, the strong fortress in the formerly Norwegian province of Bohuslän, on what's today the northern bit of the Swedish west coast. The military takeover was complete, but the Swedes still had a considerable way to go to capture the hearts and minds of the inhabitants of these formerly Danish territories. It's true that mass nationalism as we know it today wasn't a thing in the 17th century, and that national identity was a privilege for the literate elites. Nonetheless, these former Danes weren't particularly happy about having old trade routes cut off and having to pay taxes to the King of Sweden, who up until recently they had been told was their enemy. Tax strikes and riots popped up here and there, and the Swedish authorities had their hands full pacifying the locals without using so much force that they'd risk provoking a general uprising. As the Swedes were busy trying to control his former subjects, old King Frederick III passed away in 1670. His son and heir, Christian, was crowned the following year at the almost ridiculously scenic Frederiksborg Palace north of Copenhagen. In generations to come, the palace chapel at Frederiksborg would become the traditional spot for coronations of the absolute monarchs of Denmark. New elaborate crown jewels were also made for the coronation of the first ever absolute king of Denmark. Since Frederick III had turned this country into a hereditary monarchy, the succession itself occurred with a minimum of fuss. After all, it had been known for many years that Christian V would one day inherit his father's position as absolute monarch by the grace of God. From that perspective, it's a little strange that the new king was so ill-prepared for the job. Why did Frederick III go through all the trouble of making Denmark a hereditary kingdom and his descendants absolute monarchs, only to then keep his eldest son away from all business of state, and had only given him the most rudimentary education? Foreign visitors marveled to realize that Christian V didn't even speak French, only German and Danish. To his credit, though, it should be noted that the new king did not suffer from the Dunning-Kruger effect. Christian V was well aware of his limitations. Not that it bothered him particularly much. He claimed that his favorite pastimes were hunting, lovemaking, war, and maritime affairs, and he spent lots of time doing what he liked the most. Not only did he have a dozen children with multiple women, he also spent considerable time and money on hunting. At great expense, he prepared a vast hunting ground north of Copenhagen, where he'd be able to hunt on horseback, in a style he'd been introduced to at the court of none other than the Sun King himself, Louis XIV of France. The business of governing Denmark was largely left to the king's trusted advisors. When choosing these advisors, Christian V cast a wider net than most of his predecessors had done. He actively promoted talents from among his commoner subjects and the German duchies of Schleswig-Holstein in order to further marginalize the old Danish noble families who'd controlled the country until just a few years ago. Of course, the commoner advisors were usually ennobled before they could take up high office, because having an actual commoner making decisions would be madness. So maybe it's better to say that Christian V thinned out the nobility by adding many new counts and barons, thus limiting the power of the old aristocracy. One of these advisors was a man called Griffenfeld. Actually, his name had been Peter Schumacher, but when he was elevated to the aristocracy, he took this new fancier name. Griffenfeld spent many long discussions trying to convince the young king that he shouldn't go to war with Sweden over the lost eastern provinces. At least not right now. It was a bad idea, and it might end badly. But it was an uphill battle. Christian V felt that Denmark should have gotten more from the Treaty of Copenhagen in 1660. The great powers had saved Sweden after its unjust attack on Denmark. This was probably true, but it didn't change the fact that the great powers didn't want Denmark to regain control of the eastern shore of the Øresund Strait, and without their agreement, it would be tricky to pull it off. The Dutch, English and French had made it abundantly clear that they were very happy with this new situation where no one country controlled the Øresund, and they weren't interested in Denmark reclaiming Scania. Denmark also had financial problems. If they wanted to raise a new army and beef up their fleet, they needed money. Lots of money. And they needed to raise it from a tax base that had been drastically reduced, since Scania, Bohuslän, Halland and Blekinge now were beyond the grasp of the Danish tax collectors. But even though Griffenfeld had several strong arguments, he wasn't able to convince the king to let go of the idea of reconquest. In his desperation, Griffenfeld turned to the French, Sweden's ally, to have them stop the war. Unfortunately, when King Christian found out, he didn't take too kindly to this initiative, and he condemned the hapless advisor to death. The sentence was later commuted to life in prison, but Griffenfeld would never again advise the king. Despite Griffenfeld's misgivings, the Danes managed to raise the funds to kit out a new army and fleet, bigger and better than ever before. At the same time, the old buddies in the anti-Swedish club, that is Brandenburg, Poland and Russia, were also showing an interest in attacking Sweden, which was getting too big for its own good, at least in the mind of its neighbors. Partly because of this involvement of other states, Some historians like to see the resulting war as a sideshow to the Franco-Dutch War that was going on 1672 to 1678. And even though there's some merit to that argument, I'll focus exclusively on the Scandinavian theatre of war. Not only because this is a Scandinavian history podcast, but also because this conflict, known in Scandinavia as the Scania War, would more than likely have happened anyway, even if the French and the Dutch had been the best of friends at the time. Either way, in 1675, Christian V was ready. He declared war on Sweden together with Brandenburg, which attacked Sweden's North German possessions. The following year, after the war on the continent had weakened both Sweden's hold on Pomerania and its fighting spirit, the Danish army was shipped across the Öresund Strait and landed in Scania. For some reason, the Swedish Regency government had neglected the defense of Scania, so the Swedes could do little to stop the invasion. The young King Carl XI was actually present to witness the Danish soldiers being shipped across the strait, but the enraged and frustrated king could only watch ship after ship of soldiers land. There were only some 5,000 Swedish soldiers in Scania at the time, spread out across the whole province, and Christian V was now landing with 15,000 men. When the King of Denmark stepped onto Scanian soil again, he was so excited he did a little triumphant dance. People around him, both soldiers and locals, congratulated him on the return of Danish rule to Scania. When the Danes entered Helsingborg on June 29, 1676, they raised a huge Danish flag at the top of the castle tower. The oversized flag measured 17 times 7 meters and was meant to signal to everyone, especially the Swedes, that the Danes were back in control. In the months that followed, town after town in Scania threw open their gates to the Danes who were greeted as liberators. Many locals were also willing to join in the fighting in the Free Corps, or the so-called Snaphane units. They weren't regular soldiers, but civilians who fought a kind of guerrilla war behind enemy lines. These Snaphane units made the situation unbearable for the Swedes. Thanks to their activity, little or no provisions reached the Swedish troops operating in Scania. Most shipments from Sweden proper were stopped and robbed as soon as they crossed the old border. In the summer of 1676, the Swedish hold over Scania was unraveling. Fast. The superior Danish army was pushing east, and the retreating Swedes were harassed by these bands of local guerrilla fighters. And Scania wasn't the only theatre of war where the Danes were successful. In Norway, King Christian's half-brother, Ulrik Fredrik Gyldenløve, led an army to great successes of his own. Ulrik Fredrik was the illegitimate son of Fredrik III. He'd continued the royal tradition of giving sons born out of wedlock the last name Golden Lion and high positions in the state. Gyldenløve recaptured the former Norwegian provinces of Bohuslän on the west coast of Sweden, as well as Jämtland on the Swedish sides of the mountains east of Trondheim. By the end of the summer, the Danes were advancing north through Halland, until recently a Danish province, and south through Bohuslän, a former Norwegian province. If these two armies would meet, they would manage to once again block direct Swedish access to the Atlantic Ocean. Sweden would be trapped in the Baltic Sea, with the Danes able to threaten foreign trade. This had to be avoided at all costs, and King Carl XI personally led an army into Halland to stop the Danish advance. On August 17th, he met the Danish army outside the port city of Halmstad, and the ensuing battle would turn out to be the first real Swedish victory in this war. It was an important boost to morale, not to mention that it also kept the Danes from threatening Gothenburg and Swedish foreign trade. So the plan to deprive Sweden of its west coast had failed, but the Danes weren't too worried. They still held all of Scania, except the well-fortified city of Malmö. Also at sea, the Danes, with a little help from the Dutch, had been successful so far. They had defeated the Swedes in a number of battles and skirmishes. The Swedes hadn't kept up the quality of the fleet, again due to the neglect of the Regency government after the death of Karl X Gustav. The Danes, on the other hand, had been busy rebuilding their fleet, and not least thanks to their admiral Niels Juel and help from their Dutch friends, they were now the superior power on the Baltic Sea once again. The Swedes were now effectively cut off from their German possessions, or what was left of them after the invasion from Brandenburg. But even though things hadn't gone Sweden's way so far, King Carl XI wasn't prepared to throw in the towel quite yet. Now, after the victory at Halmstad, the Swedes were preparing to go on the offensive. On October 24th, the Swedish army crossed the border into Scania. In early November, they set up camp north of the Kävlinge River, less than 10 kilometers north of the city walls of Lund. It wasn't much of a camp, actually. It was more like dugouts and makeshift tents. Obviously, it wasn't the ideal place to spend the winter, or the night, but they had to make do. The Danes, who were encamped in a considerably more comfortable camp, controlled all the crossings of the river, so the Swedes couldn't advance any further. Despite the rough conditions, it looked like the Swedes would have to winter there, if they'd survive the winter. Because of the unrelenting attacks on their supply lines, they had little provisions, and even less dry wood to make fires and cook what little food they had. Since the invasion less than a month ago, the Swedish army had already lost some 40% of its men to starvation, disease, and the cold and wet weather. In late November, things went from bad to worse when temperatures dropped below freezing, and it started to snow. But then, just like in 1658, the cold turned from an enemy to an ally. The Kävlinge River froze, and soon Swedish scouts concluded that they'd be able to march across the ice. The Danes, on the other hand, didn't seem to have noticed. The king was quick to act, and on December 4th, under the cover of darkness, the Swedish army started their march across the river. The plan was to take the enemy by surprise by letting the cavalry attack the Danish camp. Unfortunately, they soon realized that the terrain between Lund and the Kävlinge River didn't lend itself to that kind of maneuvering. So the Swedes had to improvise. Instead of attacking the sleeping Danes in their comfy tents, they marched south, hoping to reach the high ground just north of Lund and offer the Danes battle from an advantageous position. Not only would they hold the high ground, they would also be protected from flanking maneuvers by the city walls. The Danes eventually noticed what the Swedes were up to. They even tried to race them to the hills north of Lund, but the Swedish army got there first. The battle started in earnest at sunrise, which was around 9 o'clock in the morning. Even though they hadn't been able to take the high ground, the Danes had an advantage in terms of firepower. They commanded 56 cannons, whereas the Swedes only had managed to bring along 8. The Danish army was also larger than the Swedish one. There were approximately 13,000 soldiers fighting for Christian V, infantry, cavalry, and, for some reason, a unit of Dutch sailors who found themselves rudely awoken and ordered to fight a battle on land. King Carl XI was eager to join the fighting, and he personally led an attack on the Danish left flank, hoping to smash through it. As usual, the scene was chaotic, and at one point the King of Sweden ended up in the middle of a Danish unit that he mistook for Swedes. He even started to shout orders at them until he noticed that they carried a Danish flag. At that point, he wisely withdrew as quickly as he possibly could. The ferocious Swedish attack led by the king paid off, and it only took about an hour before the Danish left flank started to waver. The king urged the cavalry to push on, and soon the Danish troops were in full retreat. Some even panicked and started to run for their lives. Any military tactician will tell you that this is one of the most dangerous things you can do on a battlefield. And the Swedish cavalry proved this point, cutting down fleeing Danish soldiers left and right. The pursuit of the fleeing Danes continued all the way back to the Kävlinge River. Unfortunately for the Danes, the ice no longer held, and many of the fleeing soldiers either drowned or froze to death after they ended up in the water. That meant that the Danish left flank was all but annihilated before noon. The right flank fared better, though. There, the Danes managed to grab the initiative and pushed the Swedes back toward the city walls. The Danes could smell victory in the air. The enemy had nowhere to flee, literally with their backs against the wall. The increasingly desperate Swedes were considering giving up. They were tired, demoralized, and outnumbered. Not to mention leaderless. No one had seen the King of Sweden for several hours by now. No one knew where he was, if he was even still alive. Meanwhile, King Carl was so wrapped up in the excitement of the rout that he at first planned to continue chasing the fleeing Danes all the way back to Landskrona, another 20 kilometers to the northwest. If he had done so, what was left of his army outside the walls of Lund would probably have been destroyed. But in the end, the king decided to return to the main battle and reappeared north of Lund at around sunset, which was about 3 o'clock this December afternoon. The king and a small group of soldiers broke through the Danish lines and joined his put-upon army. Seeing their king gave the Swedish troops a badly needed boost, and they rallied. They attacked the Danes with a renewed vigour, just as the rest of the returning Swedish cavalry attacked from the north. The Danes actually still outnumbered the Swedes, but they now lost the initiative, attacked from two directions in the fading daylight. At some point, the remaining Danish cavalry withdrew and melted away into the darkness, seeking the safety of Landskrona. The Danish infantry wasn't so lucky. They had no escape route, and many of them were hacked to death on the battlefield as their formations disintegrated. The Swedes kept up their relentless attack for 2 hours. At 5 o'clock, when it was already completely dark, the ceasefire signal was sounded. The Battle of Lund was over. The Danes had lost. The King of Sweden entered the city, where he was greeted by the bishop, Peter Wenstrup. He'd been preparing a festive dinner to entertain the winning monarch, whoever it might have been. Wenstrup himself probably preferred the Swedes, because he'd been battered up ever since they took over Scania. But his wife was still staunchly pro-Danish, and her inability to hide this during the dinner caused some tension with the guest of honor. The battle had been gruesome, and both sides had suffered heavy losses. Due to the large number of fallen, the Battle of Lund is traditionally considered the bloodiest battle ever fought in Scandinavia. We don't know exactly how many people lost their lives that day, but contemporary sources speak of somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 dead. Worst off were those poor Dutch sailors. The Swedes, claiming they had no business fighting on land, had cut down all except about a dozen of them. Much like the battle at Halmstad, this victory boosted morale among the Swedish troops. Even though some officers were critical of Karl XI's decision to leave the main bulk of the army to chase after the fleeing Danes for critical hours in the middle of the battle, his bravery made the young king popular among the common soldiers. After the loss at Lund, the dynamic of the war shifted. Gyldenlöve was still going strong in the north, but in Scania, the Danes were slipping, losing some of their self-confidence. For instance, in May the following year, the Danes missed a chance to deal a fatal blow to the Swedish army outside Landskrona. The Swedes were badly outnumbered, but the Danish command hesitated, unaware of their advantage, giving the Swedes time to slip away. Instead, the Danes decided to try and take Malmö, which was still controlled by the Swedes. They tried to storm the city in late June, but the attack failed and cost the Danish army at least 3,000 casualties, a heavy price that the Danes could ill afford. About a fortnight later, the Danes and the Swedes did eventually fight a battle in the vicinity of Landskrona, but this time the Swedes were better prepared, and the battle was yet another Danish defeat. The summer of 1677 had not gone as Christian V had hoped. His army in Scania wasn't beaten, but it had definitely lost the initiative, and morale was low. Nonetheless, the Danish position was far from hopeless. They still held the port city of Landskrona, and as long as they did, they could continue shipping troops across the Øresund Strait to continue the war. And at sea, the war had gone far better for the Danes. The previous summer, the Swedish navy had suffered a stinging defeat at the Battle of Öland. The battle had cost the Swedes 2 admirals and, arguably more importantly, 3 of its largest warships. Since then, the Danes had controlled the Baltic Sea, isolating Sweden from its German possessions and making sure that fresh Danish troops could be shipped over to Scania whenever they were needed. For obvious reasons, the Swedes wanted to change the state of affairs, break the Danish naval blockade, and perhaps even bring the war to King Christian's backyard in Zealand. To achieve the same, the Swedish fleet needed to find and defeat the Danish one. The Swedes sighted the enemy in late June, and on July 1st, the two fleets met in a battle in Køge Bay, just south of Copenhagen. The Swedes were optimistic. They had the larger fleet, 47 ships, all in all, and 9,200 men. The Danes had 44 ships, but several of them were undermanned, and they only had some 6,700 men. But what the Danes lacked in manpower, they made up for in leadership. The Danish fleet was commanded by Admiral Niels Juel, a highly capable and experienced naval commander. The Swedes, on the other hand, were commanded by an admiral with 0 naval experience. That turned out to be just as bad as it sounds. In the short summer night between June 30th and July 1st, the Swedes were forming their line in preparation for battle. Maybe it was because they weren't rushing things, or maybe it was because of incompetent leadership, but one of their largest ships ran aground in the dark and was out of commission the following day. Not a great start. And it pretty much continued that way. The Swedish admiral made a series of misjudgments, which not only led to yet another ship running aground, but also let the Danes fight the Swedish fleet in small groups, neutralizing the Swedish numerical advantage. Not that the battle was a cakewalk for the Danes. Admiral Yule had to move from ship to ship twice after his flagships were so badly damaged that they couldn't go on fighting. Still, the Battle of Køge Bay was a triumph, both for Niels Yule and for Denmark. It's considered the greatest naval victory in Danish history, and rightfully so. The Danes only suffered 100 dead and 275 wounded. Even though a few ships were badly damaged, the Danes didn't lose a single vessel. The Swedes, on the other hand, lost no fewer than 3,000 men and 11 ships. Far from breaking the Danish blockade, the battle solidified Danish control over the Baltic Sea for the foreseeable future. The Swedish dreams of taking the war to Denmark was effectively crushed. The lines of communication between Sweden and its German possessions were also definitely cut off, and the Swedish troops in Pomerania eventually had no choice but to give up the fight against Brandenburg. From now on, the war didn't move much. Scania was mostly in Swedish hands. The Danes held the town of Kristianstad in the northeast and the fortified port city of Landskrona on the Øresund Strait in the west. But the Swedes controlled more or less the land in between, and let's not forget Malmö. The Danes started to realize they wouldn't be able to retake Scania, at least not this time around. So Christian V eventually ordered his soldiers to burn it all. If he couldn't have it, no one would. Everything should burn. Every town, every village, every farm, every field, every boat, everything. By 1679, France had achieved what they wanted in the Greater War, and so the French decided the fighting in Scandinavia should wrap up as well. They stepped in and forced the two sides to sit down and accept a peace deal that would basically restore the status quo. The Danes argued that they should at least be given something, a small territorial gain, but the French diplomats' response was famously, not a single village. That meant that also the successful troops from Norway had to withdraw from all Swedish territory that they had captured. Thanks to its French protection, Sweden also regained most of its German possessions from Brandenburg. The deal to end the fighting in Scandinavia was confirmed in the Treaty of Lund in September 1679. The city had sustained heavy damage in the recent Danish arson campaign, but they found at least one house that was fancy enough to conduct the negotiations in. After the deal was done and dusted, Christian V went back to his old hobbies of hunting and womanizing, leaving most of the day-to-day governing to his trusted newly ennobled advisors. And that was probably one of the best things he ever did as king. In 1683, a major legal reform was completed, and the first ever unified Danish law code was introduced, a code that covered the whole kingdom without any exceptions. 4 years later, a similar unified code was introduced in Norway as well. In 1688, Denmark also saw the introduction of the land register, which was meant to simplify the calculation of the value of land and facilitate taxation. Reforms of the legal system and taxation were all well and good, but what most Danes really liked about the later decades of the 17th century was the fact that the economy started to recover. Danish exports, especially cattle, but also grain and fish, started to increase again after years and years of war and decline. All over the Netherlands and northern Germany, people were eating Danish beef, restoring the Danish economy one cow at a time. Amazingly, even the relations between Denmark and Sweden improved in the years following the Scania War. This was perhaps best symbolized by the fact that Christian V's sister, Ulrika Eleonora, married Karl XI. The Danish princess had actually been engaged to the King of Sweden already back in 1675. Her brother King Christian hadn't been particularly keen on the union, perhaps since he was already planning to go to war against his sister's future husband. It was the Dowager Queen, the so thoroughly maligned Sophia Amalia, who had pushed for Ulrika Eleonora to marry King Karl, because she wanted her daughter to be elevated to the status of queen, even if it was queen of the Swedish archenemy. The engagement was announced with impeccable timing, 2 months before the declaration of war. When the Scania War broke out, the 19-year-old princess was pressured to break the engagement to the enemy king, but Ulrika Eleonora not only refused, she proved her loyalty to her husband-to-be by refusing to participate in any official celebration of victories over Sweden. Beyond symbolic actions, she also looked out for Swedish prisoners of war, pawning jewelry, even her engagement ring, to buy food and medicine for these prisoners. So when the war ended, the engagement was brought up again during the negotiations in Lund. Both sides agreed to go ahead with the marriage, and in May 1680, Ulrika Eleonora was shipped over Öresund to Scania, where she was greeted by her future mother-in-law as well as members of the court and the local nobility. 2 days later, she met Karl XI for the first time, and was hastily married to him at a secret ceremony held at Skottorp Castle on May 6, 1680. The reason for the quick wedding was that the groom didn't want a big fuss. He especially didn't want the French ambassador to be present at the event, so it had to be taken care of before the Frenchman had a chance to arrive. The haste of the wedding had nothing to do with any desire on the king's part to finally marry Ulrika Eleonora. Apparently, Karl XI was disappointed when he finally met the woman he'd been engaged to for 5 years, and he complained to one of his courtiers that she wasn't exactly good looking. The courtier allegedly replied, "Your Majesty will see that within her there is an angel." I'm not entirely convinced that this really addressed the king's concerns, but to his credit, he did come around with time, and their marriage is generally described as a happy one, something you couldn't take for granted among the arranged royal marriages of the 17th century. And the courtier's assessment of Ulrika Eleonora's character has also been echoed by many others, who have described her as pious, patient, dignified, charitable, albeit only moderately beautiful. Her looks notwithstanding, she was greeted enthusiastically in Sweden as a symbol of lasting peace with Denmark. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be. The Scania War would not be the last armed conflict between the two Scandinavian kingdoms. But Ulrika Eleonora, who by all accounts was a marvelous, if not conventionally beautiful person, can hardly be blamed for that. And neither can her brother, King Christian V. He never did start another war against his sister's new homeland. He died in 1699 in a hunting accident, rammed by a stag and later succumbing to his wounds, a bit like Robert Baratheon in Game of Thrones. Meanwhile, east of the Öresund Strait, the years following the Scania War were spent strengthening Swedish control over the formerly Danish provinces. Next time, we'll take a closer look at these efforts and how the locals reacted to them. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as "Wake up early if you want another man's land or life," "Only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies," or "Speak useful words or be silent." Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop or if you just crave more content vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.